When I was a child, I learned that monsters weren't just the kind you'd find under your bed or lurking in the shadows of a closet. Sometimes the monsters lived in your house, walked in broad daylight, and called themselves family. My childhood wasn't golden. It wasn't green fields and laughter under the sun. No, it was mud-soaked boots trudging through a forest that became my only sanctuary. It was hiding under a thin blanket while screams pierced through the walls, wondering if tonight would be the night the silence finally swallowed me whole. And it was in those woods, where the world forgot I existed, that I met him, the Hanged Man. I first found the place when I was 8, running from something I can't fully remember. Perhaps a drunken rage, perhaps fists that knew no mercy. My small feet carried me deeper into the woods than I'd ever dared to go. The trees stood like solemn sentinels, their gnarled branches knitting together into a canopy so thick that daylight barely trickled through. I broke through a thicket and stumbled into a clearing. It wasn't just any clearing, it was something out of a dream or maybe a nightmare. Vines draped like curtains from the towering oaks, their leaves shimmering with an eerie golden-green glow. In the center stood a dead tree, twisted and blackened, its limbs stretching skyward as if frozen in the act of pleading for mercy. And there he was, dangling from the highest branch. The figure wasn't a man, not really. It was a grotesque tangle of roots and wood, shaped unervingly like a human form. His head tilted to one side as if gazing down at me, though he had no eyes to see. Creepers coiled around his limbs like snakes, swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. I didn't scream. I didn't run. There was something about him that held me there, rooted to the spot. He wasn't just a figure in the trees. He was watching me, waiting. I returned to the clearing every day after school. It became my haven, my church. I brought books to read, snacks stolen from the pantry, and sometimes just myself, bruised and broken, to sit in silence. I talked to him about everything, about the bruises on my arms and legs, the nights spent cowering in corners, the hollow ache of hunger in my stomach. He never spoke back, but I could feel his presence, like a shadow that stretched long and cold across the clearing. Then one day he whispered. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was the rustling of leaves, the creak of branches, the groan of roots shifting in the soil. But I understood him the way a child understands things they cannot explain. "You can make it stop," the voice seemed to say. I didn't ask how. I didn't need to. The promise was there, hanging in the air as surely as he hung from that branch. It happened on a cold October night. I had come to the clearing, my face swollen, my lips split. I was too tired to speak, but he didn't need me to. The clearing seemed to hum with anticipation, the vines trembling as if alive. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Make it stop." The air grew heavy, pressing down on my chest. The Hanged Man's form seemed to writhe, the vines tightening around his limbs as the shadows in the clearing deepened. The world went silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, no distant howl of wind. Just silence, so complete it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then I heard it. Yes, I woke to the smell of smoke. The clearing was gone, replaced by the flickering glow of firelight. My house stood before me, engulfed in flames, the wood crackling as it burned. I heard screaming, high-pitched, desperate, and then silence. The fire consumed everything. By the time the firefighters arrived, there was nothing left but smoldering ashes. They found bodies in the ruins, 3 of them. My father, my mother, and my older brother. They found me hours later, wandering the edge of the woods, wrapped in a blanket of ivy that no one could explain. I was placed with a foster family far away from the town where the fire happened. People called it a tragic accident, but I knew better. I had made a deal. The Hanged Man had granted my wish, but wishes are never free. The scars on my arms never faded. They weren't the kind left by fists, but by something far older, far darker. Vines, twisted and sharp, had wrapped themselves around my skin, leaving behind patterns that pulsed faintly under moonlight. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'd wake to the sound of whispers. "Come back," they said. Years passed, but the pull of the woods never left me. I returned to the clearing on my 18th birthday, driven by a force I couldn't resist. The forest seemed darker, the air heavier. The clearing was just as I remembered it, but the hanged man was gone. In his place stood something new, a figure, tall and thin, cloaked in shadows. Its face was featureless, its limbs too long, too sharp. "Do you understand now?" it asked, its voice a symphony of creaking wood and shattering glass. I did. The hanged man wasn't a savior. He was a curse, and now he was free. I've never been back to the clearing. I don't need to. The hanged man follows me now, lingering just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. I know he's found others, desperate children with nowhere else to turn. And I know that one day, when my time comes, I'll return to the woods. I'll take his place among the vines. A new hanged man for a new generation of lost souls. Because that's the thing about wishes, they always come with strings attached. After the night I returned to the woods, I began to realize that the hanged man had never really left. He had become a part of me, a shadow that followed me every step of the way. At first, it was just nightmares, but then it became more real. I felt his presence, especially at night, when my room was dark. One time, I woke up with a start, cold and shivering, with the feeling that someone was standing right next to my bed. But when I turned on the light, the room was empty. Still, the smell of rotting earth and wet leaves lingered in the air. Another night, I heard a low hissing sound, like the sound of a rope being pulled tight. It came from the corner of the room, where the old mirror I usually avoided looking at stood. When I turned around, I saw a shadowy figure in the mirror, something like a hanging body, twisted in an unnatural position. I rushed out of the room, but that image haunted me forever. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself back in that forest, lost in the dark corridors of trees. In my dreams, I was no longer a weak child. I was older, but the forest had grown with me. The trees grew taller, the roots like giant arms wrapped around my legs, pulling me down. And then, I always found the hanged man. He was no longer hanging. He stood there, pale and gaunt, his eyes empty but burning me with invisible hatred. He didn't speak, but I heard him in my head. "You called me. You made me do the impossible. Now you must pay." Every dream ended the same. Living vines burst from the ground, tightening around my neck, pulling me into the air. I struggled, but to no avail. Before I woke, I always heard the hanged man's low, piercing laughter. I started hearing about disappearances in the town where I lived. Kids my age who lived in unsafe homes started disappearing, without a trace, without explanation. One day, while flipping through old newspaper articles, I noticed something strange. Similar disappearances had happened in towns near my woods, but years apart, as if something was moving through the places, hunting for tormented souls. A black and white photo from an old newspaper article took my breath away. In the distance, hidden in the shadows of the trees, was a familiar figure, a shadow hanging from a branch as if watching. He was looking for others, desperate people like I used to be. I no longer dared to go out at night, but that didn't help. The vines still crawled through my window at my weakest moments. One time, I woke up to find muddy tracks stretching from my bed to the front door. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but I knew the truth lay somewhere much more sinister. Not only that, I realized that everyone close to me had met with misfortune. A close friend of mine, Emma, had been in a serious car accident after we had met the day before. Another, Jake, said he felt like something was watching him after I told him about the hanged man. A few weeks later, he disappeared without a trace. 10 years after that fateful night, I decided to return to the forest. It was not just curiosity, but necessity. I felt like I could not live without facing the hanged man again. As I walked through the familiar trees, I realized the forest had changed. It was no longer the safe place it had been. The air was thick, The smell of decay was strong, and the silence was so overwhelming that not a single bird dared to sing. When I reached the place I had once called my grotto, it was nothing like I remembered. Vines covered everything, and among them was something that was not the old hanged man, but a much more terrifying version. He had grown, transformed, become something that no longer resembled a human. He turned to look at me, but this time he smiled. "You came just in time. My story does not end here. I know that the curse of the hanged man does not stop with me. He is a never-ending loop, an endless hunger for darkness, ready to devour the weak and desperate souls. I could tell you the rest of the story, but remember, once you know the hanged man, he knows you. Do you hear the vines outside your window?" I stood in the grotto, staring at the new, horrifying version of the hanged man. He was no longer suspended, but towering in the center, vines entwining around his body like living armor. What had once been rotten wood was now a living entity, black, shiny, and breathing. Groans, like the sound of old wood being bent by the wind, came from him. He didn't need to say anything. His presence said it all. I could feel the hunger radiating from him, a hunger not for food but for soul, fear, and despair. "You come back," he whispered, his voice echoing across 1,000 years. "You know you belong here." I couldn't answer, because he was right. I knew that my life since leaving this forest had never really been mine. It had all been a series of days, a curse waiting to be fulfilled. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the urge from the vines that were wrapping around my legs. But I walked toward him, each step sinking deeper into my own darkness. He laughed. Not a loud laugh, but a soft hiss, like the sound of ropes tightening. "You understand," he said. "To free you, another must take your place." I paused, his words sinking into my veins. I realized that I was not the first to come to the hanged man, and I would not be the last. This was his cycle. Each person who came, desperate, was swallowed by the false promise of salvation, and then they became part of him. But this time, I decided to break the cycle. I don't know why I have this power, but there's a part of me that knows that if I accept, if I stand here and let him take me, I can stop him from reaching the others. I can end the curse he's been laying for centuries. And for some reason, I smile. "Do it," I say, my voice strange in the silence. As he drew closer, the space around me seemed to shrink. The darkness swallowed everything, and I felt the vines begin to wrap around my body, tightening by the second. It wasn't physical pain. It was disintegration. My soul being crushed, pieces disappearing into his darkness. I couldn't cry, couldn't scream, could only feel parts of me being erased, as if I had never existed. And then, I saw everything. I saw the people who had come before me, their desperate faces, their empty eyes. I saw the promises he had made and the price they had paid. They were all me and I was them. He was consuming me, but I was becoming part of him too. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer myself. I stood in the center of the grotto, the vines wrapping around me like a second skin. I could feel the forest, every tree, every leaf, every gust of wind. I was no longer human, but I was not quite him either. He was gone. The hanged man no longer existed because I was the hanged man now. Children began to come to this forest, just as I had. I heard their footsteps as they fled from lives of pain, carrying broken hearts. They came to the grotto, and they looked up at me with hopeful eyes. I wanted to tell them not to beg, never beg, but I couldn't. I was the hanged man, and I knew that this cycle could not be stopped. Every time a child looked up at me, I heard a whisper in the wind, not from me, but from deep within the vines that wrapped around me. "Will you save them?" And as they whispered their first prayer, I heard the wind answer, "Yes."
Thanks for listening to today's story. Let us know what you think. If you want to hear more scary stories, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode when we upload it. We'll always be here and welcome you.